Okay, welcome to lecture for Psych 350 Personality. We'll be talking about Chapter 4 of your text, the relevant research for Freudian theory. And we're going to talk about the research because research is one way to evaluate a theory. When you empirically examine hypotheses that can be logically derived from that theory, it can give you some information regarding how scientifically useful that theory is. Among professionals, there's a kind of an assumption that for a theory to be clinically useful, it must also be, to some degree, scientifically useful. So it must provide a way of understanding knowledge and events and observations in a way that's valid in order to be useful in the real world. So we're going to take a look at a couple of aspects of Freudian theory that have been examined empirically. But one thing to keep in mind as we do this, and as we do this for the other chapters, looking at the other theories, is it's not a matter of is the theory right or is the theory wrong overall, like, oh, it's good or it's bad. It's which aspects of the theory can be supported and which can't. And if certain aspects can't be supported, then they need to be revised. If a great majority of the theory can't be supported, then you probably need to find another theory. Okay. Starting off, let's talk about dreams. Remember, Freud talked about dreams being the royal road to the unconscious. And because dreams allowed for access to the unconscious, Freud believed that the content of dreams was important and that it reflected unconscious conflicts. Right? So the way that we're able to study dreams, obviously not directly can observe people's dreams, so we ask them about their dreams, either upon waking, or sometimes we may wake them up in the middle of when we think they're dreaming, which we usually guess by looking at brainwave patterns, and ask them, what were you just now thinking? And it's theoretically possible that one day we might be able to see dreams if the brain imaging software continues to advance. We might be able to make sense of brain waves if we can find kind of correlations between certain patterns and certain images. Then it's possible that at some point in time we might be able to extrapolate images from these brain waves, but that's probably a ways off. For now, we're left with asking people what they dreamt about. Based on studies that have been done asking people what they dreamt about, we know a couple of things. Two main points here. One, the content of dreams isn't random. At least it isn't random all the time. Some of the content may be random, and we say that because we can't find any kind of correlation between the content of the dream and anything in the person's life. But at least some things in dreams are clearly related to what's going on in a person's life. The study you read about kids living in the Gaza Strip more frequently dreaming of violence than other kids who didn't live in a geographical area that was beset by violence. So that violent content isn't random. It makes sense. It's because that's what they're living with. So there is some correlation between dream content and reality, but that's not necessarily what Freud was talking about. He was talking about the unconscious, right? He was asking, he thought that the dream content was frequently symbolic of unconscious conflicts or impulses. So let's think for a minute about maybe how you could design a study to look at that. So one thing you might think is, well, an analyst doing psychoanalysis with a client should have some idea, after doing psychoanalysis for some amount of time, should have some idea of what their conflicts are, right? And they may or may not have shared with the client the insights they've gained, right? Because the psychoanalyst waits until the right time to interpret what they've learned. So at some point in time, they will know, at least they'll think they know, what the key conflicts are, and they won't have told the client yet. So we could design a study where we have analysts identify key unconscious conflicts in a group of patients, people being analyzed, but we tell them to do so without ever asking them about their dreams. And then we have a separate set of researchers ask people about their dreams, have them keep a dream journal, and then have a separate group of psychoanalysts or psychoanalytically trained researchers interpret the dreams, and then we see, does the conflicts that they see in the dreams, do they match the conflicts identified by the other analysts? If so, then we have some evidence that yeah, these same conflicts they're seeing when talking to the person in their waking state are the ones these other people are seeing when looking at dream state material, and that would seem to be a good way to look at it. Just for your own kind of understanding, make sure you understand why it's important to have a different set of analysts identify the unconscious conflicts in the dreams and in real life. Because how would you interpret the study if analysts, you had maybe one analyst seeing a bunch of patients, and that analyst said, okay, this is the conflict I'm hearing them talk about, and they told me about their dreams, and I see the same conflicts in their dreams. There's a good correlation here. There's your evidence. Why would that not be as good evidence, as solid evidence, as doing it with separate people looking at the product of the awake analysis and the product of the dream analysis? Okay, so make sure you understand why there's a difference there. Okay, let's go a little further down that track. So if we did that study, if there was a match, what would it mean? What would it mean if analysts identified both in the awake therapy and from the dream analysis, different analysts here, okay, this client had this conflict and it showed up in both places. Would that be unequivocal proof of unconscious conflicts that are reflected in dream material? Maybe. It might be, if there was sufficient variability. But if all the clients in their dream material, the analyst said they have an issue, they're angry at their parents, and in all the kind of awake analysis, the analyst said, oh, they're angry at their parents, and we have a 100% match. Well, you just said everybody's angry at their parents, and of course it's going to match, because maybe that's just, you always say the same thing for everybody. This is kind of Barnum effect, right? With the Barnum effect, where you give somebody read their fortune. Oh, you're a person who dislikes being misunderstood by others. Oh, you know me so well. Oh no, that's true of everybody. So if analysts make these overly broad interpretations of conflicts, then the validity of the findings might be questionable, and you might wonder about what you could really conclude about that study. So it depends on what the data look like. If there wasn't a match, what would that mean? Would that prove unequivocally that there are no such thing as unconscious conflicts? But if there are, they're clearly not represented in dreams because the two didn't match up. Maybe, maybe not. Because again, we have different analysts looking at different things, and it could be that these clients have multiple conflicts. In some conflicts, analysts get access to via dreams, and other conflicts they get access to via psychoanalysis. So even if you design a study that seemingly would give you straightforward answers, that's the hard part. There usually are no straightforward answers from one study. So in science, especially psychological science, it's a series of studies that have to be done to try to get any kind of clear idea of what's really going on. But again, one thing we do know is the content of dreams doesn't seem to be random. Is it related to unconscious conflicts? The answer to that is less clear. But people who are more anxious, more stressed, tend to have more dreams and dream more about stressful, anxious things. But again, they're usually things that they're conscious that they're anxious or stressed about. Because we don't really have a good ways of knowing the degree to which they're stressed at an unconscious level. Okay. So the content's not random, and dreaming does appear to be functional, has some purpose. And we believe this based on some decent evidence, not great evidence, because we know that dreaming occurs primarily during REM sleep. Not exclusively, but primarily. So if we deprive people of REM sleep, we can deprive them of a lot of their dreaming. So the thinking goes. We can't guarantee that because, again, we can't observe people's dreams. We can't know for sure when they're dreaming and when they're not because they're asleep. But the thinking is that there's a strong correlation between REM sleep and dreaming. So if we deprive people of REM sleep, we can deprive them of dreaming, and we can look at the impact of that. And the impact is negative. You don't. It doesn't cause a mental disorder, but it does cause can cause some negative psychological consequences. People who are deprived of REM sleep have a harder time coping with anxiety-provoking events than people who are allowed to have REM sleep. So that's a finding. And then we go from the finding to what does it mean? Well, it might mean that people who are allowed to have REM sleep are able to dream, and they're able to cope with the stress and anxiety in some form or fashion in their dreams, able to work on that material somehow, and so in their waking time be less stressed. But that's not what we know. That's what we think based on what we know. What we know is deprive you of REM sleep, you're going to be more stressed. And then from there, we have to start making these theoretical, logical jumps. And you have to pay close attention when those jumps are made and think for yourself whether or not you agree with that jump. Does it seem logical to you? What are other explanations, other interpretations of a finding? And doing that is what will make you a good consumer of research, to be that critical thinker. But again, here we have, it seems that dreams may serve some purpose, some function, helping with problems, but it's not clear that they help with unconscious problems. Because again, we don't know when you have these unconscious problems, at least from a scientific standpoint. But maybe. So again, for dreams, there is some support for some of Freud's theories in terms of the content's not random, and dreams are related functionally to anxiety, and that's what Freud would have expected. Okay, defense mechanisms, which again Freud didn't write about directly, except for repression, but he kind of hinted at, and then his daughter and other theorists really added to his work, talking about defense mechanisms, the ego's way of protecting itself from the anxiety caused by the conflicts. And again, these aren't things that you can see, touch, feel, smell, so we study them primarily using projective tests. So the data gleaned from that are limited by the limitations of projective tests, which we've talked about before. But based on these studies, what we think we know is that the use of defense mechanisms, as indicated by projective tests, responds to threat. If we threaten people's identity, self-concept, we cause anxiety, people will use defense mechanisms to a greater extent than if we don't provide some threat. And that would be consistent with Freud's predictions. The other interesting findings about defense mechanisms have to do with how they change, the maturation. Going from children, early childhood into later childhood, adolescence, into adulthood, you start off with really what they refer to as immature defense mechanisms because you're a kid, and you have denial, and then as kids get older, we found these fairly systematic, and there are individual differences obviously, but there tends to be a pattern where you use denial, and then you can move on to projection, and then you move on to the increasingly sophisticated defense mechanisms, which would probably correspond with some cognitive changes, and there are other theories that we'll talk about that. But the fact that the type of defense mechanism used changes as you grow older isn't necessarily supportive of Freud's theory. The fact that they're used is supportive of Freud's theory. The thing that supports Freud's theory is that once we find that the defense mechanisms you use change over time, if we further find that people that experience high levels of stress and anxiety early in life may get stuck at a certain level, right? So if you experience a lot of stress when using at an age when denial is appropriate, you use denial and it works, well, good for you then, but then you're going to continue to rely on that, and you're going to have this kind of altered maturation of your defense mechanisms. And that's something that would be very consistent with psychoanalytic thinking, thinking about kind of the psychosexual model and fixation, right? Because Freud was all about events in early childhood influence you later in life. When you kind of can get stuck in a certain way of thinking, behaving, and defense mechanisms being a way of thinking and behaving, so that it worked at one point in time, but it's no longer appropriate for you as an adult. Okay, so let's move on now to looking at two other areas. One would be humor, which, reading that chapter, I mentioned the mommy jokes. Well, that's some evidence of repression. I'd forgotten all about those horrible jokes that we told as children. Hopefully my kids won't tell those. Anyway, some of the findings. Sex and violence are funny. At least we seem to think they're funny. We laugh more at jokes that include sexual or aggressive or violent themes, and many jokes include those themes. And Freud would say that we are laughing at them and they're not really that funny, and if you look at the jokes, the kind of the humor content, not necessarily as high as it would appear given how much you may be laughing, but we laugh at them because there's this tension that builds up when sex and aggression are mentioned, because we want sex and we want aggression, but we don't want to admit that we want those things, or we have these impulses from the id and superego saying, no, they're bad, don't talk about them. But as the joke is told, they're brought up into kind of conscious to everybody, and attention increases, and there's a punchline that releases that tension, and that's what makes you feel good, and that's why you laugh more loudly. And we like that because it allows us to vent, to give vent to those impulses in a fairly socially acceptable way, depending on how bad the joke is. So one thing to think about, though, is again, it's not clear. So it is clear that we do find jokes with sex and violence funny. It's not necessarily clear that that's because of unconscious conflicts. There's a lot of sex and violence in our world now, in our conscious world, and maybe there's something to do with that and why it's funny. So when you try to think about an experiment about ways you could look at this. One idea might be to show people a film, and you get three groups. You show one a film with lots of erotic content, show another group a film with lots of violent content, and then show another film with neither erotic or violent content. Right. So when you do that, if there are these kind of unconscious conflicts related to sex or violence, depending on which film you watch, you should be experiencing some tension and should want release. And if you use humor to give release to this tension, then you should want to tell or create or hear jokes related to that. So you could have people watch these films and then have them write a knock-knock joke, and then see across the three groups, do the type of knock-knock joke they write differ? Is there more sexual content in the group that saw the erotic film than the one in the violent film? If not, like let's say they both had sexual content, what would you make of that? Could it be that any film, any stimulus, erotic film or the violent film, that leads to arousal, regardless if it's erotic arousal or violent arousal, will lead people to tell sexual jokes? Or what if both films lead to more aggressive jokes? What does that mean? Right, so it's one thing to kind of design a study to test the hypothesis. It's another thing, again, to make sense of the results and come up with unequivocal results, which with Freud's theory, really hard to do, because we've got some kind of very loose ideas here that are often hard to quantify. Okay, so as I've already kind of alluded to, humor appears to serve a tension reduction function, and that seems to be supported by research, and so that the more tension that's involved, the louder and the longer that people laugh. So there is this relationship between tension and funny, which would be consistent with Freudian understanding. Related to this, in terms of the use of hostile humor, there's some evidence that listening to, participating in hostile humor can make you less hostile, right? Which is counterintuitive in some ways and runs counter to some other research, which suggests that doing anything aggressive or listening to aggressive stuff makes you more aggressive. But according to Freud, you're having this kind of cathartic experience and you're getting that impulse out of you, and now you can be less hostile. And some research supports this, right? But some doesn't. Some research shows the opposite, that participating in hostile humor actually makes you more hostile. So there's probably some other moderating variables that are involved with this. But it does has some real-world importance, especially right now. If you read the celebrity news, or even on the real news, it's been a story lately about Tracy Morgan telling jokes in Tennessee about homosexuals. I don't know if you even call them jokes, but a rant, part of which included talking about if his son came home and told him he was gay, or acted as if he was gay, he would stab his son to death. And some people in the crowd, by reports, laughing hysterically at this. Why is that? That there's no really humor content to that joke, to that statement. If my son did this, I would stab him. Ha! That's not funny. But they laugh. Why? Right? And Freud would say, "Oh, well, I know why." There's this unconscious impulse, aggressive impulse of hate to hurt other people who are different. And you might also say, well, they might also have some sexual things going on here, where they have their own sexual issues that they're uncomfortable with, and they hate themselves for that, and that's where some of the aggression comes from. But events like this, and some researchers say that would serve to diffuse the aggression and make people less hostile toward the group that's being attacked in the joke. But the other research says no, it actually will make them more dangerous, and kind of models that it's okay to be hostile, and it increases arousal, which is related to acts of aggression. So this type of humor attacking certain groups is potentially very dangerous. So some of the stuff we talk about should have, I hope you'll see, clear real-world ramifications. And this is one of them that Freud would have something to say about. Okay, moving on from humor, looking at hypnosis, which again, Freud started with hypnosis and then left it because of some limitations. Nonetheless, still kind of a psychoanalytic, psychodynamic concept in some ways. Some people believe that it involves an altered state of consciousness, right? And they've demonstrated that people can experience analgesia, the lack of feeling pain, and amnesia, inability to recall information, while under the state of hypnosis. And those are pretty neat studies, but from my reading, almost all of those studies can be countered by studies done examining hypnosis from a socio-cognitive perspective. In socio-cognitive theories, the socio-cognitive perspective, look at the phenomenon of hypnosis being where people's behavior are really influenced not by this altered state, but they're influenced by expectations, their own expectations, kind of cognitive things, and social pressures. So they do what they think they're supposed to do. They're playing a role. Even if they're not willing to fully admit that they're playing a role, that's what's going on. And they demonstrated that, for almost any kind of study you can look at people that believe hypnosis involves an altered state, the socio-cognitive therapists can come back and do a study and say, well, not really. Like the ones with amnesia, where people that are hypnotized afterward can't recall anything when they were hypnotized. Because the hypnotist told them, you won't be able to recall anything until I tell you you can. Sociocognitive theorists say, okay, well, let's do a little study. And they have somebody get hypnotized, tell them, you won't be able to remember anything. And then the study's done. Can you remember anything? No, I can't. Oh, wow, okay. We're going to hook up this machine now, and it can tell if you're lying. Can you remember anything? Yeah, I can remember a couple of things, actually. So, thus indicating that, yeah, they can access stuff, but they feel like they're not supposed to, and so that they say that they don't remember things. So, most of the findings about hypnosis is interesting and is still useful. I mean, people are able to have surgeries and procedures without more drugs, and they're able to deal with chronic pain sometimes with less drugs because of hypnosis. But the mechanism might not be one that's consistent with Freudian theory. One other interesting thing about this before I leave hypnosis is the fact that there does seem to be a stable individual difference in how susceptible someone is to hypnosis. Some people really easily hypnotize, some people impossible to hypnotize, and most people somewhere in between. And one interesting thing that's not mentioned in your book is that there does seem to be an association between how susceptible you are to hypnosis and your experience of dissociation and dissociative disorders. Individuals who are diagnosed with a dissociative disorder, dissociative amnesia, dissociative fugue, dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, right? The Sybil, Three Faces of Eve. People that meet criteria for those diagnoses are quite commonly much higher than average on their level of susceptibility to hypnosis. So it won't surprise you that the sociocognitive theorists, Spanos in particular, also have quite a bit to say, not only about hypnosis, but also about dissociative identity disorder and what's going on with that psychopathology, and whether or not it is true dissociation, or if it is also, to some degree, these social cognitive factors that can explain stuff. Hypnosis, there's research that says, yeah, it works, but the research doesn't seem to support that it works because it's an altered state that allows you to connect to the unconscious. So in that way, not really supportive of Freud's theory. But again, hypnosis isn't really central to his theory. It was kind of one proposed tool or mechanism to get at the unconscious. But the lack of support for hypnosis as a route to the unconscious doesn't mean that the unconscious isn't there. Okay, so summing up, there's some empirical support for Freud's theories, if you will. Many of the predictions one will make based on Freud's work have been supported, but not all of them have been supported. And the ones that have been supported, it's usually not unequivocal support. And by unequivocal, I mean, yeah, they found what Freud said you would find, but other theories might explain it as well. So just because Freud was right doesn't mean that he was right in the theory. Right? So if I say that I can predict the weather with a flip of a coin, I say if it's heads, it's going to rain tomorrow. I flip the coin and it's heads, and tomorrow it rains. I was right. Doesn't mean that I can predict the weather with my coin. I happen to be right that time. Right? Or if I say my umbrella causes the rain. Whenever it gets wet, it rains. Hopefully you're like, well, yeah, that's kind of stupid, Dr. Fowler. But you kind of get the point that just because you're right and observations would show, yeah, every time the umbrella gets wet, it's raining, the umbrella doesn't cause the rain. The rain causes the umbrella to get wet. So there's some empirical support, but it's not unequivocal. But at the same time, there haven't been studies that have come out and said, oh, this is clearly total bunk, and human nature is the opposite of what Freud said it was. Okay. That being said, it's probably declined in popularity for several reasons. Some of them social, some of them political, but scientifically the main reason would be the lack of parsimony. Like I said, a lot of the findings that support Freud can be accounted for by other theories, and those other theories are frequently much simpler, so they're more parsimonious than Freud's theories. And if two theories can explain something equally well, then you go with the simpler theory, the more parsimonious one. In Freud's theory, as most of you are probably feeling at this point, anything but simple. Okay. Lastly, is there more research to be done? Certainly. As technology advances, we find different ways to ask questions. Even some of the questions we've asked before about Freudian theory, now we have new ways of looking at those old questions. And some questions, for whatever reason, haven't been asked. So it's one of my challenges to you is to think about how you might design a study to examine this theory. So how can you draw down a hypothesis from this theory? And think of this kind of if-then setup to help you do that. So one example would be, okay, let's think about the Oedipus complex. According to Freud, during the phallic stage, boys fear castration by their father. Right? So that's the theory. So if that's true, so if boys fear castration by their father, then what? If that's true, then what would we see? Well, and then what we see, try to think of some situation where you could test that. So if boys in the phallic stage fear castration by their father, then boys who are raised without a father figure should be different in some way than boys who are raised with a father figure, right? Because if you have no father, there's no fear of castration, right? If there's no boyfriend in the home, no father figure at all, you shouldn't be worried about being castrated. How would Freud say that those boys would be different? Right? So think about the theory. What happens because of the fear? Right? Because of the fear, you identify with the father. So if there's no father to fear, then something should happen with that identification process. So those boys should somehow be different in terms of their masculinity. Right? So that's a research question you could draw down. Related to that, boys with physically larger and more intimidating fathers should be different from boys with smaller, kind of meeker-looking fathers, right? Because you're going to fear the big, scary guy more than the 90-pound weakling, you would think. And if there's different levels of fear, then that should also impact that relationship and that process, right? And that's something that can be tested. You can't test. It'd be difficult to test whether or not they fear castration by their father. Ask kids, so do you think Daddy's going to castrate you? What's castration? Probably not an appropriate study. But you think about, well, what does Freud say is going to happen? And then think about, okay, in certain situations, if this were present, if this were present, if this were happening, how would the process work? How would it be different for these people or these people? Okay? And that's one way to go about trying to generate more research to determine the validity of the theory. Okay? That's all for now. Take care.